The night sea was calm, almost glass. A Japanese destroyer, a Matsuke's, slid through the water like a blade. Its captain felt untouchable. The war report said the Americans were cowards of clouds, flying too high, bombing too wide, missing everything that mattered. Then, just before dawn, a sound rolled in, low, deep, mechanical. The lookout stared at the horizon. Nothing. Then it came again, louder this time, like thunder with a heartbeat. Out of the mist roared a shape no one had ever seen before, a twin-engine bomber diving almost level with the waves, sunlight glinting off its nose. But there was no glass, no bombardier, just metal. 8 black holes glared from its front like the eyes of some mechanical predator. The next second, the world turned white. 8.50 caliber Brownings opened up at once, spitting nearly 100 rounds every heartbeat. The sound wasn't gunfire. It was a continuous buzz, like a giant saw biting through steel. Shell casings rained into the ocean. Bullets chewed through deck guns, bridge windows, men. The destroyer's hull screamed as molten metal sprayed from the impact. And before the crew could even man their guns, the B-25 was gone, leaving behind fire, confusion, and disbelief. The Rising Sun's Navy had spent years perfecting its anti-aircraft defenses. None of it mattered. They'd been built to fight bombers from above, not monsters from below. This was no ordinary aircraft. It didn't drop bombs. It shredded ships apart. And its creator wasn't an engineer from Washington. He was a renegade pilot, half mechanic, half mad scientist. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn, whose inventions would turn the air war in the Pacific into a thunderstorm of lead. By 1943, the Pacific was bleeding. Every mile of ocean had become a chessboard of death. Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomons, a web of islands protected by warships and arrogance. Allied bombers circled above like hawks, but these hawks had dull claws. At 10,000 feet, U.S. bombers looked powerful. In reality, they were useless. Bombs missed moving ships by hundreds of feet. Torpedo planes were ripped apart before they even reached target range. And every attempt to strafe convoys ended with the same grim report. Heavy losses. No confirmed kills. Japan's supply lines remained strong, arteries pumping steel, oil, and soldiers between their island fortresses. The U.S. needed to choke those lines. Fast. But nothing in the American arsenal could do it. The P-38s and P-40s were fighters, too small to carry enough firepower. Heavy bombers were too slow and too high. The Pacific's open water turned every mission into a suicide run. Pilots joked darkly that they weren't flying missions. They were flying eulogies. Commanders sent endless memos begging for a new kind of weapon, something that could fly low enough to hit ships, tough enough to take fire, and fast enough to get out alive. No one had an answer, until a scrappy, chain-smoking pilot from Arkansas started breaking the rules. Paul "Pappy" Gunn wasn't supposed to be in the Army Air Forces at all. He'd started as a civilian, an airline mechanic in the Philippines before the war. When Japan invaded, he didn't wait for orders. He rebuilt wrecked planes in jungle clearings and flew rescue missions on his own dime. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a tinkerer, a man who saw machines not as finished products, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. And when he saw the B-25 Mitchell bomber, he didn't see a medium bomber. He saw wasted potential. The B-25 was a workhorse, fast for its size, sturdy, capable of carrying a ton of bombs. But it was designed for altitude, not close combat. It had a glass nose for a bombardier, a single forward gun, and a manual full of procedures that screamed, "Stay out of trouble." Pappy Gunn didn't believe in staying out of trouble. He leaned against the fuselage one humid afternoon in 1943, staring at the plane. "You know what's wrong with you?" he muttered. "You can't bite." To him, the problem wasn't the pilots. It was a philosophy. The U.S. was fighting a 1930s war in a 1940s jungle. Gunn decided that had to change. He began sketching an idea on scrap paper, a bomber with the soul of a fighter, one that didn't drop bombs from 10,000 feet, but tore through ships at sea level, a weapon that would turn air power from strategy into savagery. He called it simple, "Give her teeth." No one in command took him seriously. The recoil will rip the nose off, one engineer said. You'll make a flying coffin. Gunn just grinned. Then we'll fly coffins that bite back. He gathered a handful of mechanics in a sweltering hangar at Port Moresby, New Guinea. With stolen parts, coffee cans from mounts, and a blowtorch, they began surgery on the B-25's face. The rules said you needed permission to modify aircraft. Gunn didn't ask. He removed the bombardier's glass, replaced it with solid metal, and began bolting machine guns, 2, then 4, then 6, scavenged from wrecked fighters. When someone asked what he was doing, Gunn simply said, inventing survival. By the time the sun rose, the hangar reeked of sweat and gun oil. The world's first 8-gun nose was almost ready. The Pacific was about to meet the monster it didn't know it needed, and Japan didn't know it feared. But could this Frankenstein plane actually fly, or would it tear itself apart the first time those guns opened fire? The answer would come soon, in a blast of noise so violent it made the jungle tremble. They called him crazy. Not behind his back, to his face. Major Gunn, one officer snapped. This isn't a workshop, it's a war. Pappy grinned, wiping grease from his hands. Sir, that's exactly what I'm building. In a makeshift hangar outside Port Moresby, the tropical air shimmered with the heat of welding torches. The rhythmic hammering of steel mixed with jungle insects and distant artillery. Mechanics worked shirtless, soaked in sweat, hacking pieces of broken aircraft into strange hybrids. On the table lay the stripped-down nose of a B-25 Mitchell, its glass canopy gone, its bombardier's seat ripped out, wires dangled like veins. Pappy paced around it like a surgeon studying his patient. See, he told his crew, she's beautiful but harmless. We're going to fix that. He pointed to the exposed metal frame. I want 8 Brownings up front, all firing forward. No more dropping bombs and praying. We fly in low, chew the target to pieces, and get out before they even know we were there. A young mechanic blinked. Sir, the recoil alone, I know what the recoil will do, Pappy interrupted. That's why we'll reinforce the nose with a cross brace from the landing gear. If the Army won't give us armor, we'll steal physics. The first test flight was pure madness. They rolled the modified B-25, barely held together with scavenged parts, out into the sunlight. Pappy himself climbed into the cockpit. The crew begged him not to. Sir, if those guns jam, the barrels could blow backward. He laughed. Then I'll finally get the nose job my wife always wanted me to have. The engines roared. The jungle shook. As the plane lifted, everyone braced. At 200 feet above the water, Pappy pulled the trigger. The nose erupted in flame. 8 Brownings firing in perfect unison. The sound was unreal, a solid stream of thunder that rolled across the bay. The plane bucked violently, shaking like a beast trying to tear free of its cage. For a moment, the mechanics thought the nose had ripped off. Then came the radio crackle. She lives. Pappy's voice laughed through the static. And she bites. When he landed, the crew sprinted toward him. The guns were smoking, the mounts blistering hot, but the aircraft impossibly was intact. That, he said, climbing down with a grin, is how we stop losing. Word spread fast. Pilots from other squadrons came to see Pappy's buzzsaw. They stared at the 8 holes gleaming from the nose like the barrel of a god. Some shook their heads, calling it suicide. Others smiled like kids seeing their first firework. The Army brass was less enthusiastic. When inspectors arrived, they found the hangar full of half-disassembled aircraft, welding fumes, and cigarette smoke. Gunn didn't even salute. Gentlemen, he said, welcome to the future of not dying. One officer's jaw clenched. You're violating every regulation in the book. Pappy nodded. Then I'll print a new book. They threatened to court-martial him. He didn't flinch. While you're writing reports, he said, men are dying because our planes can't hit a ship. I'm not waiting for permission to win. For a few tense weeks, his unit was stuck in limbo, officially grounded, unofficially preparing for war. Then the reports began arriving from the field. Japanese convoys moving through narrow straits, undefended from low-level attack. The perfect targets. Headquarters reluctantly gave the green light. One trial mission. The order read, if it fails, the modifications stop immediately. Pappy smiled when he read it. Fair enough, he said. We'll make sure they don't have to write a second memo. Dawn broke over the New Guinea coast as the first flight of 8-gun B-25s thundered down the runway. The plane skimmed the treetops, their bellies almost kissing the jungle canopy. At 50 feet above the sea, they leveled out, invisible to radar, unstoppable in momentum. Ahead, a Japanese supply barge appeared on the horizon, small, fast, and usually untouchable. The radio crackled. Range, 800 yards. Pappy's reply was calm. Light 'em up. The nose gun spat flame. The tracers cut across the waves in perfect unison, carving a golden tunnel of death straight into the ship's side. Within seconds, the barge exploded, fuel, ammunition, and bodies vanishing in one molten burst. The crew stared through the cockpit glass in silence. Then someone whispered, "Did we just do that?" They turned for home, engines roaring. The entire mission lasted 7 minutes. When they landed, a single message was sent back to headquarters. Confirmed kill. No losses. Recommend full production. Within days, more planes arrived for modification. Guns Hangar became a factory of rebellion. Mechanics worked by lantern light, stripping glass, fitting gun barrels, and hand-welding new mounts. Every spark from the torches lit up the night, like tiny wars being fought in miniature. Pappy didn't sleep. He walked the line, checking mounts with a wrench, muttering, "Every bullet counts." When his superiors demanded technical reports, he sent photographs instead. Japanese wrecks burning at sea. "There's your data," he wrote. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. A prototype might win one fight. A revolution would need proof. And that proof would come soon, in the form of an operation so daring, so catastrophic for Japan, that even Tokyo couldn't believe what happened. Because Pappy Gunn's flying monsters were about to turn an entire sea battle into a slaughter. The first missions felt like a dare. Pilots climbed into planes patched together by courage and coffee, checked instruments that shrugged at engineers' fears, and leaned into the low, wet air. They flew not like bombers, but like hunters. The sea below shivered. The horizon waited. Pappy Gunn's idea did more than add guns. It rewired tactics. Instead of climbing to safe heights and letting bombs fall where they might, crews came in low and mean, at wave-top level, at angles that made targeting systems useless, at speeds that turned anti-aircraft gunners into frightened marksmen. Bombing altitudes fell from thousands of feet to dozens. The whole game changed. Run them flat, Gunn said simply. Make the ocean your mask and your sword. Pilots called it a baptism. Navy captains called it insanity. But the first confirmed reports began to trickle back. Freighters riddled, deck crews shredded, lifeboats burning. The phrase strafer attack slipped into radio traffic like a new curse. What made the method so lethal wasn't just the volume of lead. It was timing and integration. Gunn paired his 8-gun noses with skip bombing and coordinated fighter cover. A flight would approach at low altitude, pop bombs that skipped across the swell into a ship's side, then follow up with concentrated strafing to finish the job before anti-aircraft could be brought to bear. It was choreography and destruction in one breath. Records show that strafing runs reduce the ship's ability to fight back in minutes, often seconds. Deck crews stopped operating searchlights. Anti-aircraft stations were manned by a skeleton crew, many injured in the first pass. A well-executed attack turned a defended convoy into a motionless graveyard. The mental effect was enormous. Marauders who once sailed with swagger now crawled up the gangways like men on their last day. But innovation always has its costs. The first squadron suffered mechanical failures caused by recoil stress. Mounts cracked. Gun belts jammed in salt. Air. Pilots risked flying at altitudes where one enemy shell meant certain death. Guns modifications bent aircraft into new roles the designers never intended. Each victory carried rogues' price tags, metal fatigue, frantic maintenance, and a rolling threat from command, which alternated between awe and anger. Yet the human side of the revolution was immediate. Air crews who had once felt useless now had teeth. Confidence replaced helplessness. They returned from missions with photos of smoking hulks and grim smiles. "We're not just dropping prayers anymore," one bombardier wrote home. "We're doing things that count." Commanders noticed. Some called Gunn a genius. Others called him a menace. The Army's bureaucracy worried about precedent. If one squadron could rewrite doctrine on the fly, what stopped every unit from improvising dangerously? But statistics don't argue ideology. When guns, modified B-25s, started scoring consistent hits, the ledger tilted. Loss ratios improved. Cargo interdiction became possible. Supply lines trembled. A key change came in how air and sea forces coordinated. Naval intelligence began to feed gun targets with newfound precision. Fighter escorts learned to expect low-level ingress. Radio protocols changed. The war that had been fought in separate lanes, air and sea, merged into a single, violent corridor where B-25's nose guns rained. Questions followed the success. How far could this go? Could a medium bomber become a universal assault platform? Could the concept stretch beyond the Pacific to Europe? Gunn thought bigger. He began to experiment with heavier calibers. Engineers in distant factories wired mounts for a 75mm cannon in the nose of later B-25 models. A flying cannon, absurd until it fired. The line between bomber and gunship blurred. But nothing tested the doctrine like mass engagement. Could these flying buzzsaws strike at scale? Could they chew through an entire convoy escorted by destroyers and live to tell it? The answer would not be theoretical. It would arrive across the radio waves in one bone-deep sentence. Enemy convoys sighted heavy escort, full load of troops. Guns crews trained until their hands ached. They practiced approach vectors, throttle control, and synchronized bursts so tracers converged like an artist's brushstroke. Pilots learned to read waves not like navigators, but like tacticians. A swell could mask your approach. A trough could hide your silhouette. The horizon line was a weapon. They rehearsed aborts, emergency pulls, and how to jam an AA battery without losing formation. And then the intelligence came, a convoy hauling thousands of Japanese troops toward Lae. 7 ships, several destroyer escorts. A single opportunity. It was a gamble the theater had never seen. Every commander in the chain knew the stakes. If Gunn failed, the cost would be measured in human lives and political capital. If he succeeded, the Pacific might tilt on its axis. Gunn briefed his crews with a calm that hit a furnace. "We go in low. We hit hard. We don't wait for permission." No one liked that line in a formal report, but every man there felt the same pulse. This mission could be what changes everything. They strapped in, checked weapons, and listened to the engines like a heartbeat. On the approach to Lae, something else happened. Radio silence felt like a prayer. Pilots sealed visors. Mechanics watched from the runways with the kind of hope that only men under fire understand. A hope not for survival only, but that their wild idea might outlive them. What they didn't know then, what no one could know, was that this day would be sent back to Tokyo as proof that the war's rules had been rewritten. That shore-bound doctrine and naval confidence were now vulnerable to a weapon that combined cunning, audacity, and raw mechanical bite. The Rising Sun's doctrine had not anticipated a bomber that fought like a destroyer. It had not imagined the sky-size saw aimed at its lifeblood. As the flights assembled and pushed toward the horizon, the crews asked themselves the same quiet questions. Could precision and brute force combine to replace old wisdom? Would innovation born of desperation become doctrine? And what would be the cost when the enemy learned to answer? The answer would arrive in fire and metal and screams, and it would change the Pacific forever. They call it a suicide run on paper. In practice, it looked like madness, and then like history. It was March 1943. Intelligence intercepted a convoy steaming toward Lae. Troop transports heavy with soldiers, ammunition, and the quiet confidence of an empire that still believed the sea could protect it. Estimates put thousands of men aboard. Soldiers who would have reinforced Japan's hold on New Guinea and extended a chokehold over the Allied advance. To stop them by conventional means would take months, fleets, and a weather report the theater didn't have. Time was a commodity gun commanders no longer possessed. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. A mixed force of medium bombers, B-25s modified in Port Moresby, would attack low and hard. Fighters would suppress interceptors. Some aircraft would perform skip bombing, dropping bombs that skipped across waves into hulls. Others, the gunships, would paint the decks with such concentrated machine gun fire that diesel and men alike would be paralyzed. The hope? Turn a defended convoy into flotsam within hours instead of days. Pre-mission, the air smelled like wet metal and prayer. Gunn walked the line of aircraft, checking mounts, feeling the slight give where the nose was braced. Pilots checked each other's straps like brothers. "If we don't come back," one muttered, "tell them we did it right." Gunn smiled in the way men do when they're both terrified and hungry for proof. "We're not dead men yet," he said. "We're testing a new kind of mercy." They approached at dawn, engines a low roar against the rising sun. The Mitchell skimmed the surface, close enough that spray kissed the fuselage. The world narrowed. See horizon, the tiny silhouette of ships. Then the choreography began. Bombers peeled off, skip-bombing their charges. Others throttled to strafing speed, noses tucked, guns ready to vomit tracer like a curtain of fire. The first pass was chaos in slow motion. Tracers stitched the air, cutting through the morning like knives. Decks erupted in flame and splinter. Anti-aircraft crews, trained, drilled, confident, were shredded before they could coordinate. Lifeboats exploded. Superstructures ignited. And the sea took on a sickly orange glow as smoke and oil mixed. In minutes, one transport was burning so fiercely she listed, stern collapsing like a wounded animal. It did not stop there. Guns' formations hit again and again, relentless and precise. The 8-gun noses chewed through rails, radio rooms, and the nerve centers of ships. Where previously a single bomber might miss and live to fight another day, these modified Mitchells turned every strike into a near-certain kill. The combination of skip bombs punching holes and strafing runs preventing firefighting turned ships into tinderboxes. The numbers tell the tale. Within hours, a convoy expected to reinforce a defensive line was essentially destroyed. Reports from a theater recorded the loss of multiple transports and several escorts, with thousands of troops either killed at sea or left stranded without supplies. For Japan, the result was more than tactical. It was strategic. Reinforcements meant to stem the Allied tide never reached land. The balance in New Guinea shifted. Supply lines choked. Fronts that once seemed static began to fracture. Tokyo could not explain it. Naval communications called the defeat unbelievable and catastrophic. Commanders who had counted on sea lanes now had to count bodies. Their doctrine, refined for air attacks from above and for slower, heavier bombing, failed in the face of aircraft that attacked like surface raiders from the sky. The image of B-25 slicing to the dawn, guns barking, planes banking low, was a psychological blow as much as a physical one. Confidence evaporated. Allied losses, compared to what could have been, were small. Guns' men returned with aircraft bearing scorch marks and jammed mechanisms. But the squadrons came home with photographs of burning transports and a new morale that, bordered on religious. Pilots who had once felt useless now held proof in film strips and witness statements. Innovation worked. But proof came with consequence. The very tactics that ensured victory also exposed air crews to extreme danger. Flying at wave-top level against destroyer-caliber AA was to flirt with a one-way ticket. Several planes were lost to precise anti-aircraft fire. Mechanical failures, gun mounts shearing under recoil, barrels warping from heat, force improvisation, and constant jury-rig maintenance. Casualty reports climbed. Still, the strategic payoff, thousands of enemy troops turned into losses and logistics stalled, was undeniable. So, how did one ad hoc experiment become doctrine? The answer lies in the velocity of validation. When a tactic delivers decisive results, when a single operation alters an entire campaign, military minds pivot. Guns' modification moved beyond novelty to necessity. Higher command, initially skeptical and simmering with bureaucratic fury, found itself defending a method it had once derided. Yet there was resistance. Critics argued that the risk to air crews was unacceptable, that long-term wear on aircraft would outpace production, that improvisation undermined discipline. Proponents countered with cold calculations. Fewer convoys meant fewer frontline enemies. Fewer frontline enemies meant fewer Allied casualties in prolonged campaigns. The ledger favored innovation. Beyond spreadsheets and memos, there was a human story. Men who survived the battle came ashore changed, less cowed by command, more convinced of their agency. Mechanics who had welded gun mounts with beer cans in prayer now saw their work cited quietly in after-action reports. Gunn himself remained uncomfortable with fame. He shrugged at praise, handed credit to crews, and kept pushing modifications. Larger calibers, reinforced noses, new tactics. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, if that name later fit the engagement, left a legacy that rippled across the Pacific. Ships that previously sailed with casual confidence began to move under cloak of darkness, under escort patterns rewritten to account for possibility of low-level air massacre. Japanese commanders altered convoy schedules, but the improvisational advantage favored the Allies. The ingenuity had momentum, and yet questions remained. How far could air power be redesigned before the aircraft themselves became obsolete? Would the enemy adapt a counter that neutralized the gunship advantage? Could the air crew sustain the physical and psychological toll of repeated low-level attacks? Those questions would be answered in months of grinding combat and adaptation. But in that morning blaze of tracer and flame, one fact was clear. A single mechanic's stubbornness, a renegade pilot's gamble, and 8 machine guns welded into a bomber's nose had flipped the physics of naval warfare. A sea once thought safe had become a hunting ground in the sky. What happened next would decide whether a single innovation would change a war or merely a battle. When the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, there was silence, the kind that doesn't feel like peace but aftermath. The ocean was still burning. Wrecks rolled in slow agony as the sun came up, and in that orange light, the myth of Japan's invincible navy began to die. For years, the rising sun had ruled by intimidation. Their fleets were flawless, their gunners confident, their soldiers certain that the Americans, soft, mechanical, predictable, could never match their will. But what they hadn't expected was creativity born of desperation. Because Paul Pappy, Gunn hadn't just modified a plane. He'd rewritten the rules of survival. In the months after the Bismarck Sea, the Pacific changed tempo. Allied pilots no longer waited for perfect weather or command permission. They hunted opportunity. Convoys once moving freely under cloud cover now crawled along coastlines, terrified of shapes emerging from sea spray. The B-25 Strafer had given the Allied air forces something priceless: initiative. Guns' innovation spread like wildfire through the theater. Field manuals, once filled with safe, cautious doctrine, suddenly included a new term: low-level interdiction. Mechanics in Australia and the Philippines copied his work from photographs, replacing bombardier positions with belts of Browning machine guns. A new breed of bomber appeared, ugly, scarred, deadly. They called them flying buzzsaws. In the U.S., engineers caught up with the rebels in the jungle. The B-25H was born, the most heavily armed bomber of the war. 8 forward .50 calibers from the waist, and a 75mm cannon slung beneath the cockpit like an iron thong. The gun fired shells the size of wine bottles, meant for tanks, not aircraft. Each shot shook the plane so violently that pilots joked you could lose a filling if you smiled wrong. But when that cannon spoke, ships stopped existing. On test ranges, it could punch straight through steel plate at 500 yards. In combat, it turned coastal freighters into confetti. One pilot reported, "You didn't bomb ships anymore. You punched holes through them." The bomber had become a battleship. Historians would later argue that this single evolution, from bomber to gunship, foreshadowed the next century of aerial warfare. The logic was simple but revolutionary. Control the battlefield not by altitude, but by adaptability. From the Pacific jungles to the deserts of later wars, that idea endured. You can still trace its bloodline today. In the roar of the AC-47 Spooky, the ghostly thunder of the AC-130 Spectre, even precision drone strikes of the modern age. Every time a gunship circles above a battlefield, laying down walls of fire to protect troops below, it carries the DNA of Pappy Gunn's rebellion. But back in 1944, he was just a man with calloused hands and a brain that refused to stop turning. Command finally recognized him, grudgingly at first. Medals arrived late. Citations misspelled his name, but the results spoke louder than paperwork. His unit's efficiency ratings jumped 400% in under a year. Loss rates plummeted. Enemy shipping in his sector was reduced by nearly 80%. He had achieved what entire committees of generals hadn't. He made fear change sides. Still, bureaucracy never forgave him. One official memo read, "Major Gunn remains difficult to manage but impossible to replace." He wore that like a badge of honor. When asked how he managed such success, Gunn said quietly, "I don't build planes. I build chances." That philosophy became his signature and his curse. In late 1944, during a supply mission in the Philippines, his transport went down in a storm. He didn't make it home. No last radio call. No recovery. Just the sea reclaiming one of its fiercest students. The Army filed a paragraph. His mechanics wept. And the Pacific, for the first time in years, fell silent. But legacy doesn't need a grave. After the war, veterans of his squadrons returned home, scattered across America's towns and airfields. They carried his methods in their minds, lessons born not of textbooks, but of chaos. When new wars came, they passed those lessons on. Flexibility over formality, instinct over regulation, ingenuity over obedience. By Korea, the Pappy Gun principle had become unspoken gospel among airmen. If you can't win with the tools you have, build new ones. The empire that once mocked American improvisation fell under the same weight it never understood. Innovation driven by need. Japan had engineers. America had mechanics. And mechanics, as history proved, make the better gamblers. By the end of 1945, Japan's shipping losses exceeded 8 million tons. Nearly half of that destruction came from air interdiction, much of it from tactics born in a half-lit hangar in New Guinea. Imagine that. An empire's lifeline severed not by admirals or grand strategy, but by one man with a wrench, a vision, and a disregard for orders. Even decades later, when historians reviewed the Pacific Campaign, one question lingered. What if Pappy Gunn had been silenced earlier? What if the Army had succeeded in grounding him for insubordination? Would the Pacific War have dragged on longer? Would the Bismarck Sea have been a victory, or another graveyard of missed chances? The answers lie somewhere between what's recorded and what's felt. Wars aren't just won by bullets. They're won by moments of madness that somehow work. And Pappy's madness worked better than anyone's. In the end, that's his legacy. Not the medals or the myths, but the truth that sometimes salvation isn't orderly. It's noisy, dangerous, and improvised. A handful of mechanics, one defiant pilot, and a plane once dismissed as average became the blueprint for modern air power. Their reward wasn't fame, it was a future. So the next time you see grainy footage of a gunship lighting up a night sky, remember this, that thunder started with man in a tropical hangar, saying softly to himself, "She doesn't need bombs. She needs teeth." Some wars are won with strategy, others with sheer will. Pappy Gunn's story proves that the greatest victories begin with defiance. If you want to see another forgotten rebel who turned impossible into history, watch our next episode, The Zero Pilot Who Shot Down a Jet. Subscribe, and never stop questioning the limits of imagination.